Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the adventure of the Evil at Ra Manor, designed by Lars Erik Eriksen for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A lot of Erics up in here. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. The Evil at Ra Manor is a kind of a good old-fashioned vampire lair dungeon crawl. It is designed for 5th level, so solidly into tier 2, and reach the next power level for a lot of player characters. It's a basically 2 dungeons put together, although the first dungeon is a non-combat dungeon. It's actually just full of role-playing and intrigue and investigation, and I think it's very well done, considering it takes place in a brothel. It could have all kinds of problems associated with it. From what I read, it seems to treat everything well, with the caveat that I think this entire product still is in bad need of a content warning sidebar, some kind of, just friendly reminder about how to handle a brothel situation with role playing, especially because one of the things the players can do and the DM suggests is that they can take the role of the workers there. So that, I think you can do that, and I think the designer actually, it's a tenuous thing to introduce in any medium, let alone in a role playing game, but I think this handles that fairly well, but you definitely need some very good content warnings, some sidebars, as well as advice that you have to go over your players about consent and everything else. So, but I think it does that part pretty well. And then the second half is a manor dungeon that's been taken over by vampires. It's very light on the story, which is a bummer, and I feel like from the beginning it sets out a pretty good story. I like the way it starts, and I like all the investigation you can do to learn more clues and information from the brothel in the first half of the dungeon. But once you actually reach the manor dungeon, which is huge, it's a 2-story manor plus an attic plus a dungeon. It's like 20 plus rooms. Unfortunately, the storytelling kind of just peters out, which is really disappointing, especially because vampires has to be one of the most fun, villains you can have in terms of just their attitude and their verbosity and the way they can. They've always got these plans, and they're often haughty and constantly being able to talk to the players, and they've got the regeneration to back them up. Like, it's just such a great tool for the DMs to use. And if you don't have any good things to do with that vampire, then you really dropped the ball, I think. And this one actually even has several vampires, and they're basically just almost like random encounters. Like, it's really disappointing. So basically, I think this whole adventure is kind of a mixed bag, and I'm going to go over it in a little bit more detail. But at the very start, I just want to say that I think it's got some fun ideas in here, and I like vampires as enemies, and I like the investigation part at the beginning. But there's also a lot of shortcomings with this adventure that ultimately, I think, holds it back from being a recommendation, ultimately. So, as I mentioned, it's a 5th level adventure. It starts off, there's no really multiple adventure hooks. Instead, the party is basically given a quest to go help out this proprietor of this brothel, which is called the Little Pleasures, because they're all small-sized people that work here. So, goblins, halflings, gnomes. And the proprietor is a goblin woman, and she has hired the party because her people have gone missing, and she blames this creepy manor that has, the usual story. It's been fallen under disarray, and bad things are happening over there. People are hearing noises, and there's still staff that work there, which the interesting thing is, it's not meant to be this big creepy, oh, we don't know what's going on there. It's more like people are getting rumors, and there's still people working there that, it's part of a functioning town. Weirdly enough, this takes place in a town called Tikek-Zaz, a thriving mining hub and port. We don't get any information about this town other than a few sentences. If you're going to have it on the DM's Guild, you could just, pick a city that takes place in, the Forgotten Realms universe. You don't have to do that. But if you're going to use your own city, then do something with it. I feel like I don't know anything about this town, and literally this whole adventure takes place in this town, and yet the one location is the brothel, and then you just go to the manor, and that's it. So the advantage is, yeah, you could pick up and drop this anywhere. The disadvantage is I don't know anything about this town that you've created and named and given this a couple of sentences for. So that part was kind of weird. I'm not going to put that as an official con, but just a weird little side note that I just didn't know anything about. Like, what happens if the players are like, oh yeah, let's go to a town, now let's go shopping and stuff. This doesn't provide any information. It doesn't have, even like a little sidebar about like, hey, here's the local tavern, here's the local smithy. Like, there's nothing there, so that's a bit of a bummer. But when they arrive, they save the proprietress's daughter from an attack by ghouls. So obviously they know something's wrong there, and the ghouls are trying to kidnap people and take them back to this vampire manor. I mean, it's not supposed to be this big, like, huge mystery. It's kind of almost hilariously obvious how much there's evil things going on in the manor. When they get to the brothel, though, I thought it was, I was nervous, let's be honest, about how brothels are handled in D&D. And I think this does a pretty good job of, it's fairly inclusive. We've got different, races and different sexualities that are available here, and there's different clientele that's here. Everybody's respectful. It's one of those where you can get a room and like all the rooms are themed in different ways, and they're not even necessarily, it doesn't even have to be a sexual thing. It can be like, oh, this person reads you poetry, or you just kind of sit and talk to somebody. It's almost just like companionship, but obviously there's beds and all these things because that could be, included in that. So it's kind of like a high class, like safe, positive brothel, and I appreciate that. And with the caveat that the goblin proprietress has a secret passage that goes all the way around all the rooms, so she can make sure to check up on everybody and make sure everything is, everybody's treating everybody with respect and doing all that. And the party can use that to their advantage by going around and eavesdropping and spying on, which I guess it's all kind of fade to black. There's nothing, it doesn't really get explicit, but it does mention that, the party can learn all this different information about, there's these, here's a back way in, and they can get like a laundry bag from one of the servants, and then they could dress as guards. They can get 2 different maps, which is pretty cool. Although, as much as I like floor tile puzzles, one is probably enough per dungeon. There's 2 of these and they're back to back, which is kind of awkward, but you can potentially learn both of these. I think that's actually a really clever thing, is to give the party the solution to a puzzle before you give them the puzzle. That's actually a really cool twist that I appreciate. I don't like that it happens twice here, but they basically get this, they can potentially steal or pilfer, however else, this information, and then they don't even know what it's for. They just see this kind of, coded, it looks kind of like a floor thing, and then when they reach that room in the dungeon, they can be like, okay, this is how this solves and this pertains to that. I thought that was pretty clever. Or the designer suggests you can have the players literally take on the role of all the workers here, and then they can make charisma checks to try and get this information out of their clients. And that's, all of that makes me very nervous to be able to even handle and run. And I think you can do that. I'm not saying you can't do that. And I think this designer does do a pretty good job of bringing this place to life and making it a positive, neat little brothel area. But I think you definitely need a lot more content warnings and information here. We basically only got like a single sentence that was, make sure it says not go out of the comfort zone of your players as you ask them to roleplay employees at the Little Pleasures. The players can also use their own characters to impersonate employees of the brothel, will face difficulties if not considered a small creature. That's basically all it mentions about that little. So I think that needs to be a way bigger thing about. And plus there needs to be a content warning based on, like, later on there's some pretty nasty mutilation that you can find. Like, just, I don't know, if you think it's anything beyond a regular PG-13 rating, whatever that equivalent is, like, just go ahead and include that as a warning at the beginning. I think that would have been, nice to have. So I like the brothel thing. I think it works very well for me. Yeah, this is, are you telling me this is a goblin? Come on. Now I will, what I will say is this adventure features original commissioned art for this adventure, which is awesome. Really, really gorgeous art throughout. And I think it really adds a lot to be able to have, the characters that it speaks of and the villains depicted there as original characters in the art. That is a really, really cool addition. So huge thumbs up to that. I think that's awesome. On the flip side, the maps we get, boy, I wish we would have commissioned some map art or something, because especially, again, in most of these adventures that are, pretty, under 50 pages, for example, they're going to involve dungeon crawls, and that's the main focus. And if your dungeon is just graph paper, for somebody like me who plays on a virtual tabletop, it sucks. Like, it sucks to be able to use that. I can't use that. I mean, it helps for visualizing the dungeon layout for sure, so it's better than nothing, but that's all it is better than nothing. So that part's disappointing, especially because we got really good like character art and I guess it's mostly character art that we got, like monsters and stuff, not real environments. But the map art is unfortunately a huge disappointment, so that's a bummer. All right, so the brothel, we learned a lot of information. We learned possibly clues to some puzzles, and we've got some idea that there's some evil stuff going on there. Then we move to the manor. There's a really weird organizational thing where the manor continues the room numbering of the brothel. So the brothel was rooms 1 to 13. The manor is rooms 14 to 40. I've never seen an adventure do that before in my life. You know, usually every dungeon is its own numbering. So you start off with number 1 for each dungeon. So that threw me for a loop because I was initially like, wait, where's the first 13 rooms of this dungeon? That honestly confused me for a long time before I realized what the designer did. That's just a weird side note. I've never seen that before. Also, the designer seems not very interested in actually creating obstacles for getting into the manor, and it even mentions inside the grounds, you can add as much or as little as you like in ways of obstacles for your players before they enter the manor. The main focus of this venture lies inside the manor. It is left to your discretion. Well, yes, everything is left to my discretion if I'm the DM running this adventure. That doesn't mean I don't want you to provide some content for my players to be able to get inside this manor, because I think one of the most interesting parts of having a dungeon that's in the middle of a town is it kind of turns into a little bit of a heist, at least for getting into the place. You know, are you just kicking down doors, you're running over the fence and doing whatever, or are you trying to sneak in and with guard patrols and all that? All of that has potential to be very interesting, but none of that's here. Instead, the designer just kind of mentions in passing, like, hey, you could have wolves roaming the grounds, or magical mist traps, or pit traps, and all these, like, it's just a list of suggestions and not actual, like, real concrete details for getting inside. Like, the designer just doesn't care about the outside of it. I think that's a huge misstep. You know, treat the outside courtyard as your first room of your dungeon, basically, and that kind of sets the tone. And I think a lot of players would get excited about the possible heist implications of trying to get inside, or maybe they want to use, if they've got their guard uniforms, you know, how does that help them get inside, or if they want to sneak around, like, or if they sound off an alarm, how does that work? You know, I think all of that has the potential. Or maybe they can convince people, persuasion check, like, hey, there's evil shit going on here, we're here to help. You know, all of that stuff is what I would have liked to see as options, instead of just kind of a minor list of, hey, here's some suggestions of things that can get you inside the manor. Once we're inside the manor, the dungeon works a lot better. It's, you know, because it's a manor with a central staircase going up, there's a lot of opportunity for the players to explore on their own. You know, there's, of course, the usual creepy stuff. There's the servants who are just standing there in the dining room hall, and they will start serving which is odd. They'll just start serving the player characters, even though they're clearly dressed like adventurers, like gonna loot this place. And the players can notice, you know, the wine is actually blood and all that. There's a really hilariously awesome stair slide trap, which I am always a big fan of, a trap that can separate the players, especially because there's a pretty big dungeon area that's basically full of all the boss vampires that you don't want to run into. But I think that's because they're just, you know, hey, let's go up these stairs, and the first couple of people on the stairs can trigger this trap and go sliding down into the dungeon. That worked really well. And then when you get to the second floor, you can find the Earl, which is Earl Magnus Ra, and we get the like portrait, and then we get his actual what he looks like now. And there's a curse spin on him where basically he is being fed off of this vampire wife he's got. You know, always do your background checks, especially if you're rich. And he can't die as long as she's still alive. There's some kind of curse there, and she's just forcing him to sign all the documents, essentially run the place while being literally shackled to his bed and unable to really do anything. The weird thing about this dungeon, which I had another major problem with, is that these vampires, they exist in their, you know, coffins in their dungeon, but also they are random encounters that the party is meant to face. Every time you enter a room, you're supposed to roll a d12, and if you roll basically a 9, 10, or 11, or 12, then you've got one of these boss vampires appearing. So it's a 5th level adventure. Your head boss, the wife Tara, is a reduced stat block vampire. It's like a CR8, and it is provided in here. And then the other two are vampire spawn. And then Tobias, I forget what stat block he is, like a noble or something. I think he's got his own stat block. He's somebody that is in love with one of the vampire spawns, but is trying to like turn her back into a human, and he can maybe be reasoned with. The fucked up thing is that these are all treated as just kind of random encounters without any like dialogue or story implications or anything. So they could literally spawn anywhere. They just attack the party, and I forget how vampire spawn works, but I know the vampire itself, when they reach 0 hit points, they can just retreat, go back to their coffin, and they regenerate basically after a short rest, and can just continue hunting the party. That seems incredibly dissatisfying from a narrative standpoint, though, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this review, vampires, kind of along with hags, are one of the best villains for just really screwing with your party in terms of and having like real fun, like hamming it up with the dialogue and the social encounters and all that, and none of that is here. It's really disappointing, especially because we just had a really great social dialogue, role-playing heavy dungeon. I hesitate to even call it a dungeon because it's not like you're fighting anything in that brothel, but it is kind of where you're exploring, you're doing all the other things in a dungeon almost. Whereas here, there are some opportunities for combat, but it almost just relies on this random encounter table to provide a lot of the combat throughout the dungeon, and I hate the fact that it uses what should be potentially cool vampire, essentially mom and the 2 vampire twin daughters as your random encounters. That sucks. I don't like that at all. That was a big turnoff for me. There are some nice little puzzles that you can encounter with the vampire daughters in their bedrooms. There's paintings where if you solve the puzzle with the painting, you'll get extra like clues or magic items or gifts or something. I thought that was pretty well done. And if you mercy kill the Earl, you can make it up to the attic, where you will recognize the floor puzzles that hopefully your party got one or both of those, so they got the clues to that. I like floor puzzles. I like the idea of getting the solution before the puzzle. I think all that works pretty well. I don't like the fact that it's just 2 floor puzzles back to back, and both of them are just nasty traps. One of them, the gate's shut and gas pumps into the room, and the other one, literally, it is like it's stepping on a minefield. They're like fire. Each one of the spots is a fucking fireball ready to explode, and they're guarding the family's like treasure cache or whatever, treasure room, which has a shit ton of great treasures, like 5 magic items and a bunch of gold and stuff, which is purely optional, which is fine. But I would have preferred if we had just had some variety there. Like, one floor puzzle is good. The other one, we even have giant statues here, which there's a puzzle where you can go around and get the statue pieces from different parts of the house. That's really good. Just make it so it wasn't a floor puzzle. Make it so there was some note about, as a riddle about the statues or something that you have to solve in order to make it in there. Or something different than 2 floor puzzles back to back. But I think it does a pretty good job of checking the box of, exploration and hazards and traps. There's plenty of that. And then for role-playing purposes, there's basically the Earl you can talk to, there's the servants you can talk to, and then there are captives in the dungeon you can talk to. Combat-wise, it's actually pretty light, unless you're using that table constantly and then weirdly like hitting your players with these vampire, which I think the vampire spawn can do the same thing, maybe, where they also retreat. And I guess that's where it relies on a lot of the room-to-room combat. So it's not a whole lot of like enemies being left somewhere until you get to the dungeon, and then it's full of monsters, because these vampires are also they're capturing people, mutilating and experimenting on them for reasons we're not sure of. But one of them is like, of the 3 people you go to rescue, one of them, his arm has been cut off, and the other one, she's got the arm like sewed to her chest. Like, that's pretty grisly and gnarly, and I feel like there should be a content warning about that, because that's pretty messed up. And a lot of them, they're like really in bad like mental states. Like, it was not a very dark theme, even though it's a vampire manor, it wasn't like a super dark theme. Like, even the old man, he's shackled, but he's not like really fucked up. But then you get to the dungeon and you're like, oh god, this is really grisly. So I feel like it just kind of hits you with a wham at the end. The other weird thing is, and I got a lot of complaints, I understand, it doesn't have a good narrative end to this dungeon. The conclusion is just, hey, you freed the captives and you killed the vampires. There's no real boss room, for example. Like, there's 2 rooms with the coffins. One of them has the 2 daughter vampire spawn, the other one has the wife vampire, and just if you kill her and destroy her coffin, however the vampire thing works, you win. So it's very weird, because potentially you could slide down that trap slide, I think you end up in room 36 is when that happens. And you could immediately just go and fight all the vampires, and then you've essentially completed the dungeon. So there's no... and there's if you fight the boss and don't even realize you're fighting the boss, I think that's a problem with the narrative and pacing of the dungeon, because it's just no different. I don't know. It from a narrative standpoint, from a pacing standpoint, like all of that kind of falls apart pretty quickly. Even if it's the last thing you do in this dungeon, you've done everything. You explored the manor, you did the traps in the attic and did all that, and you went down and did this last. It still doesn't feel like it's a big climactic boss fight room. It's just, okay, here's, oh, the vampire's here, and maybe we beat her up earlier or something. Maybe if there had been a lot more notes on her, like harassing people and having dialogue and different scripted events happening throughout, I think that would be the better way to do it, rather than just relying on this random encounter table to have the vampires appear. Maybe do a scripted thing where it's like, hey, the first time they enter the attic, the first time they enter the dungeon, these things can happen and appear. So yeah, it needed a lot of changes in my opinion. These are the other weird mutant creatures that they're making. There is a really nice appendix section where all the NPCs, especially during that brothel dungeon, were given a lot of different notes and rumors and information that they have that the players can learn. And all of that is given in a really nice, easy to read format here in this appendix. And then we've got some unique stat blocks in Appendix B. I also want to call attention to the potential dice checks, which is something I don't think I've seen another adventure do that I did like that this designer did, which is anytime there were chances for to roll insight on somebody, or investigation on something, or perception, or thieves tools kits, or whatever else. Basically, anytime there's mentioned of a dice check, at the very end of that room section, it will just write all of those down here in kind of a nice little almost bullet point format. I think that was a really good way of organizing it and allowing me, the reader, to at a glance look at each room and be like, okay, how much interactivity is it? With the caveat that, of course, players will decide and suggest to do their own thing and make their own checks, but that's still very helpful to see, like, just how interactive a room is and what the different things are that players could potentially do. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for The Evil at Ra Manor. Pros: the brothel works surprisingly well as a non-combat dungeon full of intrigue, role-playing, and investigation. I was very nervous when I read that there's an entire brothel area and that the players could potentially even be employees and they have to get information from people. Like, oh, that seems like it has a potential to go very, very bad. And I thought the designer did almost everything very, very well to making it go well. Well, we'll get into my cons about the content warning, but I thought this part of it actually worked very well for me. Pro: the large Manor Dungeon provides ample opportunity for socializing, fighting, and exploration. It does cover all of the pillars of D&D, and it's a pretty substantially large dungeon with plenty of opportunity for the players to make their own choices on where they want to go, and which rooms they want to explore, and the order of which they want to do things. Fortunately, the bad news is they could potentially, trigger that final boss fight early. It doesn't even really feel like a final boss fight. Pro: detailed NPC appendix organizes relevant plot information. I really like this information here, almost like this kind of card format. I think that's a great way for you as the DM and the knower of all the things to be able to parse that information per NPC. And pro: the original character art is really, really awesome. That is a huge plus to have. You could use it as handouts. You could use these as tokens, it makes it really a pleasure to flip through, is just seeing all this really incredible art. So thumbs up to that. Cons: getting inside the manor is left to the DM's discretion. I hate that. Basically, there's just not enough good. There's no content for getting into this manor, where I think that could potentially be very interesting and kind of sets the tone for the entire dungeon crawl that we've got set up. Con: it lacks a satisfying narrative conclusion, and the boss fight just feels like another room. I didn't like how I don't know. There's no narrative payoff here. There's no, oh, you've discovered my plans of transforming people into monsters or anything. It's just, okay, we're just gonna fight. I guess the enemies need a dialogue desperately, and they're vampires. Like, they should have plenty of dialogue here. Con: it includes brothel role-playing, vampires, and mutilation, but it lacks sufficient content warnings and DM advice. So as much as I'm fine with all of that stuff, and as I mentioned, I think it does the brothel very well, you definitely need to have a content warning that includes all this information, and also probably a second one that's like, hey, by the way, here's just good tips and advice on how to handle a brothel when you let your players take charge and do a lot of these things. Like, here's the best practices for doing that. I think that would be a huge helpful to include. And final con is the map art. Unfortunately, it does not hold a candle to as good as the original character art does. And the map art to me is the more important element, because as a player of VTT, that's what I'm going to be using, and it sucks. If this were really good map art, that would have gone a lot. It would have really elevated this adventure to me. Instead, does not. Final verdict, the evil at Ra Manor is a good old-fashioned vampire lair dungeon crawl with some fun ideas, though its many narrative and design shortcomings hold it back. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. And you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Thomas, Adam, Stan, William, I'm Loud, Al, Kyle, Scalenia, Genocider, David, Jammin' Clam, Seth, and Nebula99. Gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, James, and Lacer. Thank you all very much for your support.